Fifth, they desire to bring about the fullest collaboration between all nations in the economic field with the object of securing for all improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. Sixth, after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, they hope to see established a peace which will afford to all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their own boundaries, and which will afford assurance that all men in their lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear or want. Seventh, such a peace should enable all men to traverse the high seas and oceans without hindrance. Eighth, they will believe that all the nations of the world, for realistic as well as spiritual reasons, must come to the abandonment of the use of force, since no future peace can be maintained if land, sea, or air armaments continue to be employed by nations which threaten or may threaten aggression outside of their frontiers. They believe, pending the establishment of a wider and permanent system of general security, that the disarmament of such nations is essential. They will likewise aid and encourage all other practical measures which will lighten for peace-loving peoples the crushing burden of armaments. So Professor Hall's reading of this document is that it's a progressive one. Yes, there was kind of realpolitik to deal with, but nonetheless it's a kind of stepping stone for humanity, where you have two political leaders of different backgrounds, of who have different constituencies to please, but nonetheless you kind of come together and articulate some rudimentary notion of universal law and universal human rights and so on. And so Hall kind of riffs off the Atlantic Charter and contrasts that with the kind of Hitlerian kind of lawlessness, absolutism, kind of supremacism, and the kind of disregard for humanity which the Nazi state embodied. And so that's of interest. And then Professor Hall draws upon his really deep knowledge of the kind of colonized, because we're talking, remember, the title is Colonization, Decolonization, and Capitalism. So this chapter deals a lot with the kind of capitalism, but it's also dealing with colonization and decolonization, right? You know, imagine you were Polish in World War II. Or you would experience the same experience that the Indians were experiencing as the United States Lebensraum was coming towards them and hitting them like a train. Likewise, if you were a kind of a Teutonic manifest destiny type, you would be experiencing colonization as a progressive, forward flowing thing. But if you were a Slav or a Jewish person, or you were being colonized and enslaved the same way that the Native Americans, the blacks who were enslaved and so on, experienced the Lebensraum policies of the United States of America. And so Professor Hall talks about people like Webb Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, George Padmore, and others who, Nelson Mandela, for example, referred to the Atlantic Charter in a very positive light. He said, some in the West saw the Charter as empty promises, but not those of us in Africa. Inspired by the Atlantic Charter and the fight of the Allies against tyranny and aggression, the African National Congress created its own charter called African Claims, which called for the full citizenship of all Africans, the right to buy land, and the repeal of all discriminating legislation. So Professor Hall writes, the Atlantic Charter extended and expanded the same traditions of Anglo-American constitution making, which gave rise to the Royal Proclamation of 1763 earlier. So, very interesting. And the Royal Proclamation of 1763 is a kind of key treaty which Professor Hall kind of uses at the core of his concept of a fourth world, which I'll go into in another YouTube. And the Royal Proclamation certainly merits another YouTube, but briefly it was the decision made by King George III regarding westward expansion of the British Empire prior to the American Revolution. And Professor Hall, like the Atlantic Charter, looks upon this as a kind of stepping stone achievement of humanity towards the ultimate goal of universal law and universal accountability for those who violate the rights of indigenous peoples and the right to economic and cultural self-determination of indigenous peoples. And so you can see the Atlantic Charter in this context is being looked upon very favorably by colonized peoples in Africa, peoples who like that rhetoric of self-determination and freedom from want and warfare. And why shouldn't they? And to hear that coming from people like Churchill must have been quite symbolic for people living in the colonized world, which was, of course, the majority of humanity, right? Who weren't, who lived under the the weight of imperial rule, European, Anglo-American imperial rule. And then Professor Hall draws upon his native studies background, which he's very knowledgeable and well published about, and discusses something that was called the Indian New Deal, which emerged, which is another feather in the Rooseveltian system's cap. The Indian New Deal was conceived by a gentleman by the name of John Collier. Professor Hall writes, like the Royal Proclamation, the Indian New Deal had faults and limitations. Both initiatives, however, should be viewed in the context of their times as a highly significant step aimed at easing the injustice directed at the indigenous peoples on the very continent where formal imperialism of the British Empire gave way to the informal empire building of the New World superpower. So one theme in Professor Hall's scholarship also is the notion of, well, you have globalization, and Professor Hall's, one of his core theses is that globalization didn't just happen since like the 1990s when the Soviet Union imploded, but it happened since 1492, or over a much longer period. And so one of the main themes you'll see if you read Professor Hall's scholarship is this concept of imperial globalization and anti-imperial globalization. And if we can get out of the kind of box imposed on us by political scientists that globalization, that the world started interacting at a global level in the 1990s, because this word globalization became popular then. But that really this process of globalization's been going on for centuries, and part of it has been imperialists going out with their ships and their armies and hunting for colonies, and the kind of mercantilist system engendered that imperial globalization. But then, of course, you have anti-imperial globalization, where you have indigenous people who say, well, we're not going to be very good if we're divided, right? If you say, for example, in India, in the case of India, well, you're a Muslim, I'm a Sikh, he's a Hindu. But no, the Indian National Congress had to form coalitions. In South Africa, the African National Congress had to say, well, you might be from this tribe and I might be from that tribe. But unless we form unity and solidarity with one another, we're not going to resist the imperial globalization, the imperial wrath, which is powerful and is to some extent unified. And so this kind of dialectic that you can witness Professor Hall describing. And so the idea that, the Royal Proclamation, well, the fact it came from the imperialists, and the Indian New Deal, the fact it came from the people who were dictating to the colonized Native Americans, was significant, and I'd agree with Professor Hall. I'd concur with him that these things that kind of emerge from the imperial core are of high significance. And the idea that the dialectic would kind of acknowledge that, well, in countries like Canada, imperialism was terrible in many ways, and there were some positive things, and it wasn't all good and it wasn't all bad, and the colonized people weren't all the victims, they weren't all good, they weren't all bad. Although, generally speaking, it would be fair to say that imperial globalization was misanthropic and anti-imperial globalization was empowering and humane and something to be celebrated over the former. But still, the idea that how do we interpret these things? How do we discuss these things? How do we come to understand the legacies of colonialism? And did colonialism end? In 1945, are we really living, like anthropologists often utter, that we're living in a post-colonial age? Or is colonization even more acute and more refined and more lethal than it was under the formal empires of the British Empire? For example, imagine Mahatma Gandhi walked in a Guatemalan village and started organizing a salt march, for example. He would have been assassinated in 2 minutes in the American Empire. But in the British Empire, he had courts to walk into. It wasn't perfect by any means, but certainly I would say that the the colonization that we've experienced since 1945 has been 10 times